Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to the Old Theatre at the London School of Economics and Political Science for this event. I'm standing in because Minu Shafiq is not feeling very well. She's feeling ill, and so I'm standing in to chair the event. I'm Steve Machin. I'm a professor in the economics department, and I'm the director of the Centre for Economic Performance here at LSE. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all here this evening. We're here to mark the release of I think is what we can call a field-defining book, Wellbeing, Science and Policy, which is the first textbook that's been written on the science of well-being by Richard Layard and Jan-Emmanuel De Neve, who are sitting next to me. The science of well-being is drawing on, in fact, there's a copy of the book here. The science of well-being draws on key discoveries from a number of disciplines and pulls them all together, so from psychology, sociology, economics, and others, and I think is quite path-breaking in the sense that it's enabling us to look beyond GDP alone as a measure of well-being in society, or indeed as a measure of how well society can perform for individuals. So Richard Layard, to my right, is a leading expert on the subject of well-being. He's written 5 books on happiness, mental health and well-being. He's the founder director of the Centre for Economic Performance, which is I'm the 3rd director. Richard set it up back in 1990. He's the founder director. And he's long proposed that the interdisciplinary field of well-being should become the overarching goal of government and public policy. Jan, who's 2 to my right, Jan-Emmanuel De Neve, he's a very close associate of the Centre for Economic Performance, and he's director of the University of Oxford's Wellbeing Research Centre, and he's vice principal of Harris Manchester College. He and Richard are also co-editors of the World Happiness Report, and they're co-founders of the World Wellbeing Movement. More on which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later. So with this new book, they're hoping to educate and recruit an army of academics, civil servants, policymakers and managers with the explicit aim of trying to improve people's well-being. So before I hand over to the speakers, I'll just do a few kind of housekeeping issues. So as usual, there will be a chance later on for you to put your questions to the speakers. I'll let you know when we open the floor for questions later on. When we get there, can you please raise your hand, and when or if I call on you, can you kindly give us your name and affiliation before you pose hopefully a short, concise question. So I'll try to ensure we get a range of questions from both our online audience and our audience that's in the theatre. For those Twitter users who are following the conversation, the hashtag it's got capitals on it, so I thought it's here. Hashtag LSE Wellbeing Textbook. But if I was going through all those capitals and letters and so on, I'd probably get it completely wrong. Anyway, so that's the hashtag. So the event's being recorded, and hopefully it will be made available as a podcast afterwards, subject to there being no technical difficulties, which I hope there won't be. Okay, so with that housekeeping out of the way, let me hand over first to Richard Layard, and then to Jan-Emmanuel, who will tell us much more about this exciting book. So Richard's going to go first and present 10 minutes with slides. He'll then hand over to Jan for 10 minutes with slides, and then we'll go to some questions.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. Very good for our well-being. I think I'm going to read this because that's what we do in the House of Lords. I'm going to start with the first page of the book. This is one of 19 wonderful drawings by the great cartoonist David Shrigley, and of course it's absolutely right. We must build a better world. And by better, what Jan and I mean is a world in which more people are enjoying their lives more fully, where there's higher well-being. So the basic idea is that we judge our progress as a society by the well-being of the people. And we also think that the goal of the government should therefore be nothing else but the well-being of the people. Now, it's hardly a new idea. It goes back to the 18th century Enlightenment, inspired much reform in the 19th century. It actually was the philosophy of the founders of the LSE, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. It was the philosophy of one of our great directors, William Beveridge, and it's the basic philosophy which led to his vision of the welfare state. In fact, I think it's probably the most important idea of the modern age. It brought us out of the obscurantism of the Middle Ages. So here's the idea at the top. And I like the way that Thomas Jefferson put it, that the care of human life and happiness is the only, just note that, the only legitimate object, meaning objective, of good government. And actually, I find it very difficult to think of any other reason for having a government other than to improve the life and happiness of the people. But there is one other issue, of course, that we want the happiness to be fairly distributed. So we want social justice in the way that the happiness is created and distributed. And that means, of course, that governments have a particular role in preventing misery. So the theory of government here is that they exist to create the conditions to enable everybody to be happier, but especially those who would otherwise be in misery or despair. So let's start with the issue of who are these people at the bottom end of the happiness distribution. And then how can we identify what is causing this huge spread of happiness so that we can then reduce it? So we have to start straight on with the issue of measurement. Well-being can be measured, and the majority of people who work on well-being think that the best measure is life satisfaction. So there's the question. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? With 0 meaning not at all satisfied, and 10 meaning very satisfied. So this is the question which has been asked in Britain as an official statistic since 2011 by the Office of National Statistics. It's the question that's recommended to its member countries by the OECD. I think every country except the US asks it. And the merits of this question are important, because I think unless you believe in the question, you won't believe in well-being. The merits of it are it's simple, easy to understand. You can imagine answering it yourself. And it's much better than what has often been done, where you have lots and lots of questions, and then somebody giving them some weights, adds them together into some index, and nobody has any idea what that means. The way forward is through the simple question, and that's of course also a democratic way forward with this particular question, because each person is judging their own situation rather than, as often happens in social science, some researcher comes along and judges their situation for them. So the next issue, of course, is whether these answers have information content. Can they be compared across people? And we know the answers have real information content. They're well correlated across people and over time with brain activity in the relevant areas. And in particular, they have good predictive power for objective things that you can see. For example, I mean, this is, to me, the most extraordinary fact, that a question asked, a simple happiness question asked, is as good a predictor of how long you will live as a complete medical diagnosis. It's such a simple, powerful thing. Obviously, something is being measured there if it can predict your longevity. It also can predict whether you'll leave your job or your partner, whether you'll vote for the existing government, and so on. So I want to take that that measure and show you what it tells us about the human condition. And I think this graph is the most basic statement of what we know about what it is like to be a human being on this earth. this is the distribution of happiness in the world. And the shocking thing is you can see that below, at 3 or below, you have a fifth of the whole human race, and at 8 or above, you have a sixth. It's a very, very huge dispersion in the quality of life as people experience it. Some of that is explained by differences between countries, and some of it is explained by differences within countries. So let me take them quickly in that order. Top countries are mainly Nordic, peaceful, egalitarian, and the bottom ones are mostly torn by civil conflict or repression. Other factors, when you do a regression, of course, include income, health, freedom, social support, altruism, and trust, all variables where the Nordic countries do particularly well. In fact, some of you may know the famous wallet dropping experiments. 80% of the wallets dropped in Nordic countries were returned to their owners, compared with under half in Britain and the US and under 20% in China. But although there are these big country differences, and you can see them if you look at the scores, the 80% of that variance across the whole of humanity is within countries. So within our country, there is an absolutely huge spread, as I'm sure there is in this very room. So what's explaining this huge spread within countries? I want to make a very simple point, that if your main aim is to reduce misery, you've got to know what is causing the spread of happiness, because the more the spread, the more people will be below any particular cutoff. So understanding the causes of the spread is the same as understanding the causes of misery, and you can check that out with further analyses. So what's explaining the spread? Income, of course, is a factor, but the idea that it's in any way a proxy is completely wrong, as you can see here. So let me just go through these quickly. Mental health is coming out as the biggest single factor. That is a single question. Have you ever been diagnosed with anxiety disorder or depression? Physical health, not very well measured by a number of conditions, also important. Of course, whether you're unemployed matters a lot to you, but there are more people suffering from mental illness than from unemployment. Quality of work, Jan has worked on a lot, very important. Whether you've got a partner and a decent private life, important. And income, of course, important. But let's get it in its place. It is absolutely unacceptable to use income as a proxy for well-being. So this is got by taking those measures of well-being that I mentioned, having all this other information about the person, and doing an equation regressing the well-being on these factors. A completely different way of finding out what matters to people is just to ask them straight off. And there are now a number of surveys in which people are asked, what do you worry about most in your daily life? That's the question. And then they're given scales. And the order is almost exactly the same. I mean, it is just not true that the most important thing that people worry about is income or even debt. Income and debt comes about sixth in the list of things that people worry about. They worry about their health, the health of their children, the health of their parents, mental and physical. They worry about their relationships at work, and they worry about their relationships in the family more than income. So we just have to get some perspective on what is really important in people's lives. And I kind of despair sometimes when I read the assumptions made by journalists and politicians about the order of what is important in people's lives. Now, this sort of information, that income is not the be-all and end-all, of course is the reason that the experience of happiness over time has varied hugely across countries, and it's not well related to the rate of growth differences across countries. And the most striking thing, of course, is that the United States, for which we have the longest time series of happiness, has had it absolutely flat in spite of the great economic growth in the first 25 years after the Second World War. So there's the time series for the US. No time to discuss the detail of any of this, nor, of course, the enormous difficulty of establishing causality and the good work which has been done in getting causal estimates of the effects of many different variables. That's essentially what this book is about. One variable after another, and how we can pin down what the effects are in more detail than I've been able to. And we think that the science is now sufficiently advanced for my final proposition, which is that policymakers should be making well-being their target, which means if they've got a fixed budget, they should be spending money on those policies which yield the most well-being per pound which is being spent. In a rough sort of way, this is what the OECD and the EU have passed resolutions saying, but much more concrete and nearer home is the fact that Keir Starmer has said absolutely explicitly that he will insist that the Treasury evaluate every policy in terms of its impact on well-being as well as on GDP. And of course, if that actually happened, it would have huge implications both for technically how you analyze the problem of policy choice, but also the actual list of policies. I want to stress that this is not involving throwing away traditional methods of cost-benefit analysis. They're still totally valid where they're feasible. And of course, you can convert any money measure into a well-being measure so long as you know the impact of money on well-being. But the great advantage of using these direct measures of well-being is that you can cover a much wider area of public policy than has ever been covered by cost-benefit analysis. Partha is an expert on this. I've written the book too, but it's quite a limited range of the whole area of public policy which has ever been adequately covered by cost-benefit analysis which is based on revealed preference and choice, because so many policies exist because people don't have a choice, roughly speaking, why cost-benefit analysis is not always possible. So the analysis based on well-being will have major implications for policy priorities, of course. Higher up will come mental health, child well-being, youth apprenticeship, family conflict, elderly care. All these things will be taken a lot more seriously than they are at the moment. So it really is time that we use this one criterion of well-being to evaluate the whole of public spending. as Jan will explain to you also, politicians have every reason to apply it because maximising well-being is the best way to get re-elected. So I've no doubt that in the years to come, well-being will become the objective of government. I don't know how long it will take, but that's how it will go. Well-being measured in this wider way will become the objective of government, so that more than 200 years after Jefferson and Bentham, it's surely time for that to happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening and to lend your support to our book, which we hope will be a real contribution to the field. Like Richard, I will highlight 4 insights that are covered in the book and that will hopefully give you a bit of a sense for science of well-being, and hopefully pick up a copy of the book as well. Let me start by showcasing and building on what Richard just said, showcasing the wonderful research by our colleague and friend George Ward, which was published 2 years ago in the American Journal of Political Science. George went way back into the Eurobarometer data and election history of the European nations and looked at, from the 1970s onwards, looked at all the elections in Europe and found that variation in average life satisfaction, the measure that we use, was more predictive than your traditional economic candidates for explaining incumbent vote share at the subsequent election. Now, the more you'll think about, and hopefully this book will inspire you to do so, the more you'll think about subjective well-being measures, you'll realize that in the case of voting, the subjective nature of our measure may actually have an edge over more objective indicators. After all, voting is a subjective interpretation of the world around oneself, and that then gets expressed in the voting booth. So here we may have an advantage on more objective indicators that are typically used in political science and in economics. Now, the predictive power of life satisfaction data is also in full display in relationship to social discontent and popular uprisings. I think it was the CEO of Gallup, John Clifton, who first pointed to this relationship when he noticed in his own Gallup data is that the Arab Spring, so Egypt and Syria in particular, you wouldn't have picked up on anything wrong if you had just looked at the economic data. So GDP in Egypt and in Syria were doing pretty well, in fact rising, in the run-up to the Arab Spring. Looking at the well-being data, however, you would have picked up a whole different story. For the book, we've done something similar. We've looked at the Hong Kong riots, which took place in March 2019. And what you're seeing here is even more striking, I think, than the Arab Spring story that John Clifton highlighted, which is that you see an incredible rise in GDP per capita in Hong Kong, 50% increase in less than a decade. So on the face of it, looks wonderful, doesn't it? But if you dig into the well-being data, you find quite quickly that over that same span of time, youth, the younger generations, have seen declines in the way that they rate the quality of their lives. And so something was clearly going amiss despite wonderful economic growth. If we move to the world of work, then this particular line of research that we've been carrying out, that will be familiar to the labor economists in the room, makes it painfully clear just how important work is for our well-being, and not just for the monetary or pecuniary reasons. What you're seeing here is the impact of being made redundant on somebody in our large panel studies. In this case, it's the German socioeconomic panel. And what you're seeing is that there's a whole drop in life satisfaction of 1 point on the scale from 0 to 10, which is a lot. And you'll see throughout the book, it's very difficult to move people by this much. But they do move in a negative sense when losing work. We know that about half of this drop is due to the loss in monetary, so the loss of a paycheck and being able to put bread on the table. But the other half, which is typically overlooked, is the non-pecuniary, the non-monetary elements of work. And it bears reminding that the non-monetary aspects of work that we find so important for well-being have to do with building identity, building social ties and social capital, having a routine and structure throughout your week, as well as work being a source of lifelong learning after you've left school and a wonderful school like the LSE. And so this isn't always picked up fully in traditional economic thinking, and we find this to be very strongly the case. So the focus on work, I know politicians tend to focus on jobs and work, but even more focus, or a well-being angle provides even more emphasis on this particular point. Note also that people do not adapt to falling unemployed. It's one of the few things that really, really gets under people's skin and to which they do not adapt, unlike most other things. The other thing to note is that even when people regain a job, we find that there's scarring effects. So they don't quite reach back to the same level in terms of life satisfaction and that they were at before being made redundant. A term, by the way, that would need some reframing if it was up to me. So that's the world of work and the importance of work, but let's move into the workplace itself and see a bit more whether, just like the voting bit, business leaders should care about workplace well-being for good reasons, just like a politician should care about well-being and putting that center stage in policy. But does it also pay to invest in workplace well-being? And I'm pleased to say, and I'll share a little bit of research on this, is that at the individual level, there's a very strong tie between how we feel and how productive we are. So I'm pleased to say that this work with Clément and George is forthcoming in management science, and it's taken us quite a bit of time, but in collaboration with British Telecom, we think we've been able to identify for the first time causal field evidence for the link between employee well-being and productivity. Taken us a lot of time to identify the relationship causally. The headline result, and I can speak a lot more about this, but the headline result would be that essentially feeling better by 1 point on a scale from 0 to 10 it translates into about 13% more weekly sales that week in the context of BT call centers. And there's reason to believe that this is actually a lower bound of the impact to be had. Now, you may think this is at the individual level, but does this scale to the level of the organization? And here we've got some really cool new results to discuss as well, and that you'll hear much more about, I think, in the near future, and will be foreshadowed in relevant chapters in the book. What you're seeing here is the result of a huge crowdsourcing effort that we're doing in partnership with Indeed.com around the world, but in the US, the UK, and Canada, we've got a lot of data, 13 million company reviews and counting by now, and many more coming in as we speak. What you're seeing here is there are 700 publicly listed companies in the United States for whom we have enough employee well-being data, as well as obviously standardized financial performance data, because they have to report on these things every quarter in the same way. And yes, there's a very strong correlation between the average employee well-being coming back from our crowdsourced surveys and the traditional financial metrics for these companies. So whether you're thinking about Tobin Skew, which is a measure of firm value, a return on assets, or gross profits, it really strongly links. So here, these 700 companies are binned into deciles so that it becomes a bit more visible. Otherwise, it would be one big mess on screen. So this is stuff and research that's ongoing, but makes a powerful case for why it's not just the right thing to do to invest in well-being as a leader of business, but also, I think, the clever thing to do. This is correlational, doesn't quite identify causality, but there's a lot more work to be done with these data. And one piece of work that we can do and have started doing, and that I think might be of interest to you, and I'll conclude with those insights, is does this also translate to the stock market? A lot of you may be thinking, wait, where should I maybe invest my money in terms of the great places to work? So what we've done is essentially looking at all the data that has come back in the United States and rank order all the companies in terms of the average well-being that seems to be reported directly from the employees. So essentially, rather than using life satisfaction, which Richard was describing, we tend to use job satisfaction or workplace happiness, or the absence of stress, or notions of a sense of purpose at work. And we put these 4 items into an index, and we get those data back. What you're seeing here is just the benchmarks. I haven't actually shown you the data yet because I want to keep it a bit as a surprise. Is the S&P 500, the NASDAQ 100, and the Dow Jones. So we've got these 700 companies, US listed, that we have data for, and whether we take the top 50 or top 100, but you know, the top 100 is a bit less prone to outliers, so we thought that's slightly more robust. And I'm about to show you how our portfolio has done. We started the crowdsourcing effort in 2020, and so we used the 2020 data to compile our portfolio and invest our $1,000 on January 1st, 2021, to see how our well-being focused portfolio does. And here's the result. Simply focusing on the best places to work for from the horse's mouth, so from a crowdsourced survey where people tell us whether they are happy at work, is highly predictive of how these particular stocks did. And so, in fact, whether it was the bull run of 2021, where we outperformed, or the bear market of 2022, where our stock index of employee well-being, high on employee well-being companies they were very resilient throughout the bear market. And we've updated the data especially for tonight, and you'll see that the first 2 months of this year, which has been a very volatile stock market, the well-being focused index does particularly well as well. So I think this hopefully makes it clear to you that there's a lot to be said for putting well-being at the heart of life's decisions. It's not just the right thing to do, but probably also the smart thing to do from a number of ways, for politicians, for business leaders, and even for investors, I would argue. Let me conclude, and I think there will be hopefully lots of Q&A, and we can dig much deeper into the measures and the insights coming out of our work. But let me conclude by saying that Richard and I owe a huge amount of debt to the wonderful visual artist, David Shrigley. Richard already foreshadowed this, and there's some really thought-provoking drawings in the book. The book will be made open access towards the end of the month, and the hope very much that it will help spread its message and make it accessible to everybody around the world. And Richard and I really owe a lot of thanks to a lot of people, and I will hand over to Richard to highlight and single out a number of people. From my side, I had a lot of help from Mika Katz, who's now started his PhD at Harvard and was a research associate with us at Oxford, and he was incredibly helpful throughout the drafting of this book on my end. And I think I'll hand over to Richard to also thank a few other people who've been very involved and important for the book. So thank you again for your support. Hopefully you'll like the book and help spread its message. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so my thanks are to people who are physically present here. First to Maria and Katja, raise your arms, who have provided wonderful research support. Then to Philip and Rosine, who produced this book so nicely, one the publisher and the other the production manager. Wonderful, thank you so much. Oh, perhaps you didn't hear that. Anyway, thank you so much. And finally, Joe, who held this whole project together, held me together over the last 3 years. Joe, thank you so much.
Okay, great. That was terrific. I'm going to ask a few questions and have a discussion with these two now, and then we can open up to the floor for Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to ask Richard 3 and Jan 2 questions. So the first two are going to go to Richard. So can you tell us a little bit about why you think that well-being should be the overarching good that we want to be aiming at?
Well, my approach is this, that there are many goods. Wealth, health, freedom, and well-being. They're all good, but you can ask why are they good, and for most of them you can give a further reason, like if you're sick you feel bad, or if you're enslaved you feel bad. But if you ask why does it matter how you feel, there's no answer that can be given of anything that's more important than that. So it's really the only completely self-evident good, and the others can be thought of as deriving their goodness from the fact that they are contributing to well-being. And that's the essence of the first bit of the research that we're trying to do, find how much different things contribute to well-being. And again, when we go on to what the government should be doing, it should be based on the strength of the effects of all these things that governments do. They affect freedom, they affect wealth, health, and so on. So what is the strength of that effect relative to its cost?
So that's my second question. Is it feasible? Can you say something about the feasibility of this? From what can governments do? What can individuals do differently from what they do now to kind of achieve the same?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of work involved. I mean, if you think of traditional cost-benefit analysis, it's an awful lot of work, and it's taken a lot of time chivying away at it to improve it and so on. So we're not going to suddenly produce the miracle answer, but we have to absolutely go for it. We're trying to do that in our group. That's Chris. Wave your arm, Chris. Chris is leading our work on modelling. I mean, one of the big things which needs to be done, of course, is to produce some sort of a model of well-being over the life course, and at the same time, so that you can show, what the effect of something that has a defined initial effect, how that's going to persist over a person's lifetime or not persist. But at the same time, you also need to know what the savings to the government or the opposite additional expenditures will be from an initial policy and its initial impact. So that's a big task, to produce a ready reckoner that can be used by policymakers who know the short-run effects of something but need to know the long-run effects. But of course, the short-run effects also need a lot more research too.
Okay.
No, but you said how much the difference did it make? No, I mean, we can already see that the policy priorities are going to be different. There will be more emphasis on mental health. Mental health has not risen as a share of NHS expenditure over the last 20 years, in spite of the fact that every time there's a spending review it says it should. Be more emphasis on child well-being as a goal of schools, not just test scores. More emphasis on youth well-being, I hope, getting more better treatment of people who don't go to university but need to get a proper start in working life. More attention to elderly care and well-being of elderly people. And I think I like to put this in a slightly provocative way, that these are, what I'm talking about there is what you might call the social infrastructure of our lives. And that is actually probably going to require a shift of expenditure from physical infrastructure to social infrastructure if we really are paying attention to the things that make the most difference to people.
Okay, so in the introduction I mentioned the World Wellbeing Movement. Jan, can you tell us a little bit about that and tell us what the aim of the World Wellbeing Movement actually is?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, we think it's an exciting development. So last summer, after about a years of preparation, we launched the World Wellbeing Movement, which is a coalition of visionary organizations, corporates, and foundations to really try and together put their shoulders behind putting well-being metrics at the heart of business and public policy making. And in a way, it's interesting that we're here at the LSE. The model that we're trying to emulate is essentially the Grantham Institute, and what the Grantham Institute did for putting climate science at the heart of the debate around the environmental impact and dealing with climate change. And so we're hoping very much that over the next 10 years or so, this group can help fund an organization, embed it within academia, to help spread well-being science and make it really have business and policy leaders make their decisions based on the evidence coming out of academia. So we set up a team. It's based with us at the Wellbeing Research Centre at Oxford, so trying to be as close as possible to the evidence and then bridge that gap that there really is between the ivory tower of academia and the real world out there.
Okay, so what responses have been from business?
Fantastic. So we've got, I think some of the founding partners, the names and the caliber of the name speaks for itself. So we've got companies like Unilever, S&P Global, HSBC, BT, some wonderful and important organizations like the 4-Day Week Global Movement. And I'm very pleased that Andrew and Charlotte are here this evening, have really put their shoulders behind this mission of putting well-being more center stage. And I think, when I think about the corporates especially, there's really two reasons why they seem to be taking a real interest in well-being and well-being science. One is more inward-looking, the other one is more outward-looking. The inward-looking element is related to what I presented. I think companies are starting to really get the importance of this and how it could give them a competitive advantage. And so they want to know, well, how do I measure the state of well-being of my employees? And this goes beyond just engagement metrics, so literally how people feel at work. And I think this has become particularly important to them because this is the great resignation period. And so people are moving around, rethinking what kind of work they want to do, what suits them best. And companies really know and feel that being an attractive employer, so attracting talent as a result, and retaining talent for longer, which is completely underestimated in terms of the impact it has on the bottom line. Our employee well-being plays a critical role in this because if people are happy at the place, then they stay longer and you don't have to go out and recruit new people. But I think the second reason, which is more exciting to us, I think, as a movement, is that more outward-facing, companies are keen to try and figure out how to measure their social impact. And this sits within the larger ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards. And while E, environment, is pretty well established and well measured, carbon emissions and the like, and G, governance standards, is also well established, companies and rating agencies or organizations more generally have a real issue trying to measure their social impact. And I think they sense, and we're very pleased they do, that well-being metrics, and in particular in the first instance, employee well-being metrics, is probably the stakeholder they impact the most in the first instance, are really critical and can perhaps fill in that gap of how of getting a sense for one's social impact. And so one of the members, founding members, is S&P Global, and one of the other founding members is Indeed.com. And you probably see where I'm heading with this. Indeed.com has allowed us to crowdsource comparable well-being data for lots and lots of companies, most major companies, and S&P Global needs to evaluate their sustainability or ESG standards. And so we're working really hard and have achieved and brokered a partnership between the two. And we're exploring ways, and hopefully we'll have something to report in the next few weeks or months about how S&P Global may be incorporating employee well-being metrics in their corporate sustainability assessment frameworks that then hit the ratings, which the investors and many other people care about.
Okay, so one more from me, and then we'll go to the floor. So it seems that this is an agenda very much for individuals, just as much as governments, maybe even more. So what should we as individuals be doing differently to try and improve our well-being? Either of you or both of you can give a reply.
Well, let me
Go for it.
go first. The idea that you judge a society by the well-being of the people provides an answer to the ethical question. What should anybody be pursuing? We've talked about what should government or business be pursuing, but the most important question of all is what should individuals be pursuing in the way they lead their lives? What's your object in life? And the basic answer Jeremy Bentham proposed is you should be trying to create the most happiness you can. And I think that is an incredibly powerful, inspiring message. I think we see now, you can see it in various surveys, particularly adolescents, less and less clear of what purpose there could be in life. And if you want people in general to be happy, that will only happen if everybody is trying to make people happy. It includes themselves, but it also includes the other N-1 people who are different from yourself. So I think it is a really inspiring ideal, and that's why we founded this movement called Action for Happiness. I don't think we mentioned that before, but I'm one of the trustees of this movement. I don't know how many people. Interesting. No, I won't risk it.
You can see his badge.
There will be some people here who know about Action for Happiness.
So
this is where you can find the answer to the question that Steve asked me. If you take one of the wonderful online courses or join Action for Happiness and meet with other people regularly in support of this way of living, and the pledge which the members take is I will try to create as much happiness in the world and as little unhappiness as I can. So I think that's my basic answer on individuals, and of course it includes taking care of yourself, and we know that there are really well-developed ways of improving your own well-being, which you should be following if you're to be any good to the person next door to you. I won't go into all of that, but you all know about the cognitive revolution, how your thinking can affect your feelings, mindfulness. All these things are going to be a very important part of 21st century culture. It's now still a minority. Probably, a lot of people here probably are doing it, but it's still, you're talking about 15% or so. But think of all those other people who would benefit from these insights of this mindfulness revolution.
Okay, thanks. That's great. So let's open the floor to questions from the audience. So as I mentioned earlier, can you please raise your hand? Please wait to be called on when I can see who's doing it. And I think you'll be brought a microphone to speak. So if you can say who you are and your affiliation, and try to keep it nice and concise and short, hopefully, then we'll open up the questions so we can get through as many questions as possible. That hand went up very fast there, so you can go first.
Hi. First of all, I really enjoyed your book, Can We Be Happier? And particularly the insight about that gym instructors are just as happy as CEOs, which I liked a lot. In terms of, you mentioned Sir Keir Starmer being kind of behind the well-being movement. So let's say Keir Starmer, Labour won the election, and they had, you had a chance to have one policy, you had one chance to have, one key policy that you could change that could be focused on well-being. What would that policy be?
Okay.
Should we take two or three at a time? There was a hand right at the back there, I think, before.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm a government social researcher. The Office for National Statistics has just done its review of the National Wellbeing Framework. I was interested, is there anything you would like to see come out of that? Or do you think the factors that are important for measuring wellbeing have changed since the pandemic?
I couldn't hear that. Can you repeat it? Maybe others didn't hear.
I didn't hear it all completely because I was looking around for questions.
Oh, sorry.
But it was about, the question was about what ONS could do, wasn't it? Yeah, we can't hear you very well.
Oh no, sorry everyone. So ONS have done a review of their wellbeing framework, and thank you for the presentation. Is there anything you'd like to see come out of that review? And do you think the factors that are important for measuring wellbeing have changed since the pandemic?
So ONS review.
Pandemic.
So ONS review into wellbeing statistics. And what would you like to be in it? One more. Who did? Yeah. We'll come to the others afterwards. Yeah, I think so. I think you were first, but I haven't got my glasses on, so I might not be being very precise. I could improve my well-being by probably putting my glasses in.
You take it.
Oh, could you say who you are as well?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Eugenia. I'm a second-year student studying PP here at the LSE. And my question was about the first point in your presentation, about well-being having to be fairly distributed. And it's about how policymakers should make the trade-off between improving well-being, generally, maybe from people, going from a 7 to an 8, versus people who go from a 3 to a 4. And whether, should we be focusing on those with the lowest well-being and improving theirs first? And then also the sort of international component in that, how should, wealthier countries with better well-being help out or sort of address those, less well-off countries with less well-being. I don't know. It's a lot of questions, but yes.
Okay, great. So we've got one single policy for Keir Starmer. We've got the ONS review, and we've got the social justice distributional dimensions of well-being. Do you want to take them first, Richard? And leave Jan some space to do something?
I'll take the first one.
Okay.
I know exactly. Well, I know. I've got a whole list actually.
He was asking for one. The most important one.
I'll give you number one. Knowing that mental health is so important, with other people, we persuaded the government and the NHS to establish, from 2008, a service for anxiety and depression, which now treats about 700,000 people a year. 55% become free of symptoms. Very effective. If somebody has an addiction, that service can't treat them, they're not trained to do it. There is no proper psychological therapy service within the public sector for the 1 million or more people who are addicted to alcohol, drugs, or gambling. It is an absolute disgrace. The havoc it causes in society, way beyond the individuals themselves, is untold. That's what I want.
Okay, great. Jan, do you want to take the other two?
On this, Richard obviously rightly points towards mental health. So a lot of spending on physical health, but mental health potentially equally important, but lacking, way behind in terms of spending. And especially with the focus brought to mental health and well-being because of the COVID pandemic, and it become even greater crisis. So Richard's absolutely right. If I may, a small one, I would love Keir Starmer to put a bit more onus on companies to report on the average well-being and mental health state of companies. So for example, there's a recent law around companies now have to reveal the gender pay gap. Why not ask a company to also report on mental health and well-being in the organization, and maybe even put it on the annual report, just like any other figure as part of the annual report. And if they don't do it, well, then the crowdsourced platforms like Indeed and Glassdoor will do it for them. So they might as well be first. The question around the ONS. First of all, thank you. The ONS since 2012 has been asking 4 questions, including the life satisfaction question, and also whether people feel happy, whether they're anxious, and whether they feel life is worthwhile to them. That was introduced in 2012, and how visionary it was, especially now with the benefit of hindsight of the COVID pandemic, and also other countries sort of coming online, and the OECD, frankly, following in your footsteps, or being inspired by the ONS example to write a lot more about how all statistical agencies around the world should try and capture these subjective well-being items and see how it fits and can inform and complement existing measures. In terms of changes, I think that the ONS 4 are there to stay, one would hope, touch wood, for the long run. But a lot more, and they're part of the annual population household survey, so they're being measured regularly and frequently and across large samples. My hope is that there's more sort of material around that can give us a richer picture of what drives well-being around society. So I think I wouldn't necessarily, I would stick with the same items, but hopefully have a richer set around it to provide potentially policy guidance. Because if Christian Kreckler and others have amazing work and amazing opportunities to try and influence policy, and you may know that the Green Book of policymaking in the United Kingdom now includes a supplement around how to do so using a well-being angle. And I think the ONS data needs to be sort of be made fit for purpose so that the Treasury can start really leveraging the ONS data in a way that suits them. So it'd be nice, I'm really just thinking aloud here, but what would be really cool is I think the ONS and the Treasury and people like us and Chris coming together to see what kind of measures would we need in the ONS data to really help underpin evidence-based policymaking around well-being by the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. I think then there's the very important question around inequality and
I just add though on the ONS. I mean, I think the ONS does a good job, and I believe it's going to be producing it more regularly and getting it more in parallel with the GDP figures, which will be very, very helpful. But the community has not responded to these figures. This is the problem, and particularly disappointing is the lack of interest in local authorities in their own local levels of well-being. With Maria, we're trying to do something about this, but it requires somehow, and I don't know whether the ONS can do it itself, but it requires somehow to get this, into local newspapers, local BBC broadcast, everything that's reported about income should also be reported about well-being. That's the fundamental principle.
Yeah, I'm going to add my tuppence worth on this as well. So you'll see from the presentations, especially what Jan said, but Richard also said about it, how important the world of work is here. So I think the workplace dimensions are really quite useful and very important in the context of collecting different measures of well-being as well. Okay, so let's.
I didn't get what the equality question was.
It was about the social justice and the importance of moving up 0.1 from 0.7 to 0.8, 7 to 8, moving up 1 point, and whether that should be completely fairly distributed in line with social justice kind of.
Well,
I think that's what you were saying.
Yes. I mean, of course, this is a very deep question, yeah. And the answer which would be given by our colleagues Tony Atkinson, Joe Stiglitz, was that you shouldn't just add up the well-being across people. You should give weights which imply more importance to raising low well-being than to raising high well-being. I think to make this operational, what you should be doing is, when you're analysing a policy, you should be showing how it will affect the well-being of people whose initial well-being is at various different levels, so that let the policymaker assign their own weights, or you can ask them to assign some general weight, but it's got to be taken seriously.
Okay, let's take some more. You were definitely quite fast last time. You get it this time.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Fabio. I'm a fellow in social policy here at the LSE. In the last 8 years or so, I've been working on the policy and media use of well-being metrics. And what I found, and what each and every study before mine found too, is that these metrics have hardly ever been used in policy making, let alone reported on in the media, as you were suggesting earlier before. Despite increasing interest in the well-being agenda. So for instance, in my research, I found that the World Happiness Report last year in the UK was mentioned 14 times on radio and TV. And to put it into context, the words scones with jam were mentioned 10 times more. And one of the reasons why that is the case, and that is mentioned in the literature and emergence all the time in every studies, is that policymakers and journalists are skeptical of subjective indicators. They don't find them reliable, and even though they might say that they're useful, they don't think they are reliable. So since we're talking about well-being, science, and policy, my question is, since the science is telling us that policymakers and journalists do not want to use these indicators, indeed, in your book you conclude that policymakers have yet to use these tools, then why are you going against the science? Thank you. Gotcha. In the sense that shouldn't we put greater emphasis on objective indicators and the objective dimensions of well-being. And once these become institutionalized and recognized, then try and bring the subjective indicators in rather than the other way around.
I think you should try and summarize this because I can't hear it.
You had your hand up. I'm afraid it was the person in the black shirt, I think, behind. The black shirt? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Ben Miller. I'm a fellow at UCL, but not an economist. This may be a little bit off topic, I'm not sure, but you mentioned about short and long-term effects of public policy, and so I was just wondering to what extent we should consider the well-being of future people compared to present people, where there are conflicts between the two of them, like in resource allocation or something like that.
Okay, one more.
Hi, my name's Carla. I'm the founder of a workplace financial wellbeing company. And I was really interested in one of your opening slides that showed income as being quite low down on the list of things that influences wellbeing. And I wanted to ask whether in the research you did, you explored the extent to which income was a causal factor in the expressions of mental and physical ill health in people. So to what extent does your level of income drive the your feelings or your experience of mental health? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, great, thanks. So we've got three, I think. I think I understood the first question. It's about subjective and objective measures of well-being and the relative merits of them, and the fact that it's often the subjective ones that appear in the published work. I think that's what you're asking about. Okay, yeah, good. You're nodding, so that's good. The second one is about short-term and long-term effects and whether you want to be thinking about the well-being of people in the future as well as the current stock. I think that's what was being asked, yeah. And then the third one is about the honing in more on the income effects and A, I think establishing causality, but B, the interaction between the income effects and the mental health and the physical health and the unemployment and so on as well.
Why don't you do the first one?
Yep. Thank you, Richard. But I would like to speak to the other two as well. But to your really excellent question, and it's subtle, so I hope people will follow us, but you see a move away, the beyond GDP movement in which this very much sits. You see, in the first instance, moves towards objective indicators that extend beyond GDP and incorporate things like education, health, longevity. So for example, think of the Human Development Index, HDI, think of the OECD, 11 Better Lives Framework, etc. And so these extend GDP with other objective criteria or indicators that hopefully give a better sense for whether progress is being made. I forgot the SDGs are the obvious one as well, the 17 SDGs or 15 that are relevant. Where subjective well-being comes in, and I agree with you, it might be better as sort of there's a transition going, but you'll see, for example, in the OECD Better Living Index, that the 11th dimension is a subjective well-being one. And I do hope that, that in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the transition from GDP only to sort of a dashboard of great objective indicators, that transition will move us all the way ultimately to subjective well-being being at the heart or at the core of it all. And the reason is actually quite straightforward, is one, as Richard was saying, ultimately it's about how we as individuals feel about the quality of our lives, and how education, health, mobility, income feed into that. And so but it is a leap of faith to be made, and especially by policymakers or senior leaders. And I'll tell you for this very simple reason, is that they don't like to give up control to the people and leave the judgment to people themselves. So when you speak to policymakers, they would love to be able to say, I'm doing well on the economy, I'm doing well in getting inflation down, I'm doing well in terms of raising education levels, and people are living longer, so things must be great. But the reality is the ultimate judge of whether things, the ultimate judge and judgment of whether things are going in the right direction should be the people that you're serving. And are they actually feeling better as a result? Now, likely they'll feel better because of the great things you've done on objective indicators, but is it really feeding into the ultimate indicator, if you will, of how people feel? And there's that leap of faith and that sort of giving up judgment, and that's very difficult. But there's another reason why I think once you're a policymaker who works with limited budgets and you have to prioritize between your objective indicators of health, mobility, income, education, how do you decide where to spend your money? So say you've got £1 million to spend and you've got your 10 indicators, objective in nature. At some point you have to say, well, am I going to spend 100,000 on each one of them? Or what criterion am I going to use to allocate spending? And this is where our work is so beautiful, I would argue, or elegant, or where things start clicking, is that you use subjective well-being on the left-hand side of the equation as the outcome, and then you use your objective indicators as explanators. And by running that regression, you get a sense for the relative importance of these objective dimensions that policymakers can really influence. And so, for example, while education and health and mobility and income are all important, some things are more important to some populations or some elements of the population. And so you can really reverse engineer this from subjective well-being analyses, plugging in these objective indicators to get a sense for prioritization and budgetary spending. So these dashboard approaches don't help policymakers very much because these 10 indicators that go up and down, but not like a single criterion in the end that they can use for prioritization. Sorry, I went on to a bit of we get these questions a lot, and so the team at Oxford knows that this is something that we've repeated many times.
Richard?
Well, I'd agree with every word you said. I mean, what is more important than how we feel? It's an extraordinary remark that you hear always, it's only subjective, as if that's somehow less important than something that's outside us. What is more important than what we feel? On the future, of course, the well-being approach goes almost hand in hand with a concern about climate change and the future generations, because if you think about how to attribute importance between the present and the future, that depends on what you call the discount rate. And the discount rate that we would use for well-being should be extraordinarily low, because essentially we think that people in the future matter as much as we do. We can't actually say they matter equally, because then the whole future world would completely dominate the present, wouldn't it? So we have to have some form of discounting, but very, very small discounting when we do well-being, like 1.5% per annum. When economists deal in income, they typically use much higher. The Treasury rate is 3.5, but of course many people think in terms of higher rates, and that was how some of the skepticism about the climate change movement arose, because of using these very high discount rates. So I think the well-being movement is the blockbuster which has helped to get climate change properly addressed, because of stressing the necessity for a very low discount rate. On the question of income and mental health, let's take that as an example. So the equation that I put up there is showing the effect of varying any one of these things that were up there, holding all the others constant. So it's showing the effect of a change in mental health not caused by a change in income. That of course is not the only way in which you would want to analyze policy, because obviously if income were affecting mental health and then mental health were affecting well-being, if you were worrying about the claim of a income redistribution policy against some NHS treatment policy, you'd want to take that into account. So we can handle all of that.
Okay, great. I think we've actually run out of time now. I'm sure there could be many more questions on the floor. So I think I can speak for everyone when I say this discussion's been extremely insightful and a pleasure to listen to these experts with their new book. So thanks to everybody for coming, for joining us today. Thanks to everybody involved in producing this really great event. And I think please join me in thanking Richard and Jan for the talk. It's also true they're hot off the press. There's copies of the book outside, and if you'd like Jan and Richard, or one or the other, or both, to sign the copy of a book, then the steward's instructions.
We'll be up here. We'll be up here.
Yeah. Will you be up here? Okay.
But in the meantime, I want to thank Steve for stepping into the breach so brilliantly. Thank you so much. And for being such an excellent director of the CEP. And I want him to receive the first copy of the book.
Oh, thank you. Right, thanks everybody.